So today, we're only doing a half day today, and we will be having first something I'm really looking forward to, a talk from Commissioner Adriana Labardini from the Instituto, and I apologize for my bad Spanish right away, Instituto Federal de Telecomunicación, Mexico. And that might have been kind of a French-Spanish hybrid. Sorry, 7 years in Quebec will do that. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to this talk this morning, and we have a panel, and then a discussion that we'll be talking. We'll have it's kind of about the role of academia. I think that as I said yesterday, one of the things that's really unique about this conference is that we've got the academics in one place discussing this issue. To my knowledge, that hasn't happened, and I think we really have to take advantage of that moment. So first today, Commissioner Labardini is a lawyer from the Libre de Derecho Law School and director and founder of the Alcosumidor, an independent civil organization which defends the rights of consumers and users of telecommunications in Mexico. Commissioner Labardini has served as an advisory council of various public institutions in Mexico, including the Federal Consumer Protection Agency, the former Federal Communications Commission, and the National Advisory Committee on Standardization of the Ministry of the Economy. She has also served as technical secretary on the board of the Federal Telecommunication Commission from 1999 to 2003, and for 16 years worked as an associate and partner in a major law firm specializing in areas of corporate law, administrative law, and telecommunications. She has a master's degree in law from Columbia University in New York, Columbia well represented here this week. And she's an external professor at the Center for Economic Research and Teaching, and is a former Fulbright scholar and social entrepreneur in Osaka. So I'm thrilled this morning that we're going to be hearing from Commissioner Adriana Labardini.
If you don't, thank you, Greg. No. Can we pass to
get your slides up?
Thank you. But in the meantime, good morning, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I want to congratulate University of Calgary and Greg Taylor and you all that form part of this research project on the spectrum. I think it's a fabulous and most necessary way to gain and knowledge, and to make that knowledge available to policymakers, to regulators. It's wonderful to keep us a bit apart. Academia must feel totally free and independent to research and write, but we need those who believe in change and that everyone can be a change maker. We do need the policymakers and the regulators to listen what you have to say on all different issues. And so I feel really honored to have been invited. I'm not an academic, yes, but I had this wonderful Professor Noam in Columbia University, from whom he really inspired my whole career and his knowledge and research. So we need to be exploring a number of visions, and I think it's the attitude at the Institute. Not only that, but we decided that it would be important to have within the Institute a research center. So we founded one. It's a small research center that, independent from us, they mostly do economic and engineer research on telecoms, and it's headed by a very well-known doctor, a PhD in economics, graduated from Yale, Dr. Pascual Garcia de Alba, and he has a wonderful team of researchers. So it would be great to somehow introduce you and all this wonderful network to our Center of Studies at IFT. And okay, this morning what I'd like to do is speak general, give an overview about Mexico and where we're standing and why this institute, what do we do and what are the challenges? What have we accomplished in only 3.5 years upon the creation of IFT? And all these accomplishments at the Institute I'll be reporting to you. But then I have these thoughts and concerns and ideas for the future, and those are my own, not necessarily shared by the Board of Commissioners. I mean, it's just the forward-looking issues and the prospective thoughts I have around spectrum. So, just a second. Mexico, or I should say Mexico's. We are a country of around 120 million people. Only Mexico City and its metropolitan area accumulate 22 million people. Can you imagine that? And where the whole republic is divided in 32 states, and there are states with less than 1 million people, like Baja California Sur. So there are quite a few low-density areas across the country. In the last few years, after reform, this constitutional and legal reform happened in 2013, and then the IFT was created and the commissioners appointed, and then the Telecommunications and Broadcast Act came into effect in 2014. And since telecom GDP has grown 4 times more than the general GDP. But there's another Mexico. There's the rural Mexico with around 22% of the population scattered in all this, almost 200,000 locations, really small, sounds familiar with Canada, but with very, and it's my top concern, socio-economic inequalities. Urban households on average have incomes 7.6 times larger than rural households. And we'll talk about penetration later. So we have those, I mean, both faces, urban, modern, state-of-the-art cities, and then rural cities. Before we go more into the data and what we've done with spectrum and the different bands, these are my central ideas. I don't have a paper, I suppose. You all have papers already, the new wonderful ones, by the way, you've been presenting. This is like an abstract, or what would try to become a paper, and when the evolution we've had. But this is how I see it. Spectrum as a scarce public resource, very valuable, that has become, or has always been, but now more than ever with the wireless hype, an essential facility to digital economy. But it's not a goal in itself. It's I mean, what we really would have to look after, and this is not only IFT, but the whole federal and local governments and all the stakeholders, is how to improve the lives of Mexicans, productivity, economic growth, how to maximize social welfare with efficient policies, including an efficient spectrum policy, but also with a strong emphasis on competition, which is also a means, by the way. I don't see it as the only and final goal, but it's such an important means, competition, because as I'll show you in a bit, we come from highly concentrated markets, and not only in these industries, but Mexico, for many, many reasons, has been traditionally a oligopolistic, if not monopolistic, economy held by very few groups, and that has held us back for decades. And the poorer you are, the more you pay in a monopolistic environment. So we need to change that. And one of the things that struck me many years ago, Professor Noam wrote this article long ago about, so what's a spectrum? Is it a piece of land that we should be parceling and assigning under exclusive rights, or can we start looking at it as a platform where you only need to make sure no one crashes and be an air traffic controller? And so to avoid interference, can it be shared, or some can be shared or not? Many of the ideas that were raised yesterday, I share them. When is it better to grant an exclusive license, or for what services, or for what bands, or not? Or should we move in the direction of more unlicensed or shared spectrum under what legal titles as well? We call them concessions, what you call licenses, and licenses on spectrum are for 20 years, which also we should have to think about all these paradigms. Unfortunately, we chose some already, not the regulator, but in the law, and that the basic principles. I'll tell you more about that. And so, why are we doing licensing? Forget whether it's auction or not, that comes later, but exclusive licensing. For economic reasons, or to avoid interference, or because it is a more efficient way to allocate a scarce resource. So we need to be thinking on those questions. Now the principles, because, well, we are an entity, and all regulators and governments are that need to work and act on within a legal framework. So after this reform took place, very atypically, some of the spectrum principles were put in our Constitution, believe it or not, to make sure no one would contest those principles in litigation under the claim that this and this legal provision is unconstitutional. So I started litigation that lasts for 10 years and I hold all the public interest back. So as Judith explained yesterday, they decided to put many of the telecom, broadcasting, and the organization, institutional arrangements in the Constitution. And that included the spectrum. So already we are constrained with some of these principles, but some are pretty progressive and good. We don't only have commercial licenses for spectrum and for telecom services and broadcasting services as a whole. That we have commercial licenses, public, private, and social. Under social license, we include community, but not only community radio or community TV, but also community telecom networks. And under that category, we have a very specific, because of inclusion and human rights issues, a section devoted to indigenous licenses. These are licenses for spectrum or wireline if applied by an indigenous community. We have so many ethnicities in Mexico and over 62 different languages, and we need to make sure they have access, and this is also in the Constitution, to means of communication. They are entitled to own their networks to provide services and spread the culture and language within their communities. And then we have commercial and private licenses given with exclusive rights, primary basis for 20 years. And so what we do annually is we publish a frequency program. So this year we're going to auction this for commercial purposes, and this and those frequencies are available for either public safety or public broadcasting, AM, FM, or digital TV. And these other bands and frequencies are available for community, that is, social licenses. And so each year, everyone knows what is available to be allocated through either auction for commercial or a direct allocation or assignment. And there are some rules. No, federal government, which I find really anti-federal, but federal government has a a preference over, for instance, on the 800 band for its public safety purposes, but over state governments, and so on. And also there are some exceptions like experimental and amateur radio. Although it's considered private use, it won't require, of course, a bidding process. It would be inefficient. But there was another principle, which is this one, that I find terribly important and has not had the emphasis it should have been given. And it's a principle under the Constitution, and said, hey, well, we do think that auctions are a good and efficient procedure to assign this resource to people that appreciate the most by paying millions of pesos, but that should not be the only criteria to be included in the bidding rules. I mean, it can be a combination of money, but also you can include as part of the winning criteria other issues, whether it's coverage, as it was in the 700 shared network. That was not an auction for the spectrum, but a competition to see who would win this public-private partnership contract. But you can include some other criteria. When it comes to broadcast, we should have included, but a dissenting vote there, not only who pays more for an AM, FM, or TV channel, but who's going to provide local content, for instance, who's going to provide more independent productions, Mexican independent productions, or some time to education, but that was considered to be censorship. And so no, it was absolutely left to free market. The only non-monetary criteria that was added, if you present a proposal for radio, for FM and AM radio, including digital radio, then you get extra points. Or if you are a newcomer, a new entrant in the radio, and so you get extra points. But there was no premium for some content-driven new proposals. We do want to encourage pluralism in media, not a bit of more of the same, and that should have been, I guess. And now, competition and the existence of new players in itself provides some degree of pluralism, but local content is something I'm a bit worried about, that it's not being incentivized or encouraged somehow. And so, especially in TV, I mean, we're watching maybe, 70% US content. Anyway, now, one of my other concerns is, okay, we're putting out in the market more spectrum and much more than was put in the last 20 years, and we will keep in that trend, but no matter how much spectrum we put out there, especially for IMT, for mobile services, there will always be underserved or unserved locations or areas, really remote, just like Greg was telling us, remote and rural locations. It's a market failure. No one wants to. And this is not inventing. This is the state of Oaxaca, very dear, wonderful, culturally rich state. It's a wonderful place to go. And this, I know it's hard probably to see, but so all these red dots are the communities that have a population between 1,000 and 2,500 people. And the blue ones are the base stations where we see there's service. So, and of course, our geography as opposed to Calgary, so mountains, and it's really hard to get every single village connected. But this is too much. I mean, in this state, 62% of the locations are not served. not by Telcel or America Mobile, not by, now we have AT&T entered the market 2 years ago, nor by Telefonica, our three commercial operators, Telefonica, AT&T, and the incumbent Telcel with a large market share. And so what will we do? This has been going for a long time. Telcel claims I do cover 93 or 92% of the whole population. Well, yeah, but not of all populations and people, but not all the locations. And we need to get these people connected, to include them, not only now for voice or data or messages. It's a way to get them education, to get them out of poverty, to provide health services. So this, in a way, explains that we now have the social licenses, the community licenses, but it also explains the frustration and the reaction and say, so you claim it's just too expensive to put there the infrastructure, and that was always the argument. You have as much spectrum as one could have, and you still don't deploy in those areas, and even less if it's data, not voice. So we're going to work on an infrastructure sharing model, and that's what it is, the 700 megahertz band network, so that you don't have to complain about infrastructure. So provide the service, and this PPP will deploy the infrastructure. And now, okay. So these are only 3 of the poorest states, and Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Guerrero, and with a penetration of, and this is only voice, I think, right, James? Less than 60% penetration. And no matter how much spectrum we put out there, because so far IFT has decided not to include coverage obligations in the auctions, something I have also opposed, that will remain. I mean, through commercial licenses, they are not interested. They don't see, which is quite sad, because I do see a business case for the base of the pyramid in the future, as more these people receive remittances from the US, etc. I think the larger we make the pie based on scale, maybe their ARPU won't be $40. Of course, it won't. They make less than half of that to survive. But I think if a mobile broadband penetration of 60% is all we want to, that's not ambitious enough. But so there's, as you know, many different things to do for universal services, and we can combine both, and I think we will get better in the following decade. One, because of the shared wholesale network that will provide this high-speed LTE network in rural areas, but up to 92.2 of the population. But it will help, I think, definitely. But also, thanks to grassroots projects like this community license. So for the first time ever, we issued one of this license to a wonderful project that has been, it's not only a technology project, but a community grassroots project working with the people of different villages in Oaxaca. It's called TIC, Indigenous Community Telecommunications. It's a software-defined radio technology. I've been there in the mountains of Oaxaca. So far, it's a 2G network. They are using this just for 2+2 megahertz in this band of 847 and the higher band as well. I went there 3 years ago, and it was, I made that picture of, it says, ambulant commerce is prohibited, and then they give you the information. It's called Talea de Castro, the municipality. It has 2,437 people, and like 1,600 meters above sea level. And now they tell me it's connecting 22 rural communities, all, close, no? With only 4 megahertz. They applied for 8. We only gave them 4, which I didn't agree with that either. But it's a big change. They own the network. They manage the network, all software-based, and they were trained, so they don't rely. I mean, there was this mayor that was helpful to get the project, the down costs invested, but I guess with the help of wonderful social entrepreneurs, technology, legal, and very devoted people, they are training the people. So capacity building is a must. We don't want no one to depend of a network administered by third parties. And it has an average of 3,000 users and all community owned. I took actual pictures of that's the antenna, and here are Peter Bloom and Eric Huerta and a community member, and he's being trained to run over the database. And this is an interesting picture. This is our incumbents site in the same place, put under a universal service funds years ago. It got subsidies from the government, spectrum for the government, to provide this rural telephony network. As you can see, it's brand new. No one uses it, and it was a big failure. It's more like a public telephony service, so you pay like, I don't know, like $0.50 per minute for a local call. I mean, who's charging for local calls anyway? But they have that infrastructure that could have been shared and used by someone, but no. And I mean, you ask the people, would you like to use the Telmex phone that's in this mom and pop store? Because I went to store, so where's the phone here, the Telmex phone? Well, it's falling apart back there, but it's too expensive. Who wants it when we are now using this mobile, used, not fancy 2G devices, but for the first, this is a different world. They don't really need to be Googling that much. They need to communicate among themselves and with the neighbor community and with their migrant people, if there are any left in the next few years in the US. But these are people that Oaxaca maybe has exported workers of millions to the US. So that's what they need, is to connect with the next community in Oaxaca, Mixtec or Zapotec, or to communicate to California or New York for that matter. Now, the problem as I see it, and with all the changes and the regulations we have passed for the incumbent and unbundling copper and fiber and all these mandatory rules to access the incumbent's network, that is improving, but we still need the backhaul. So a project like this one would need, in order to provide internet, a backhaul, and that's expensive. I think the initial capital was like $10,000, but they would need more than that for. So when it comes to fiber to the home, it's only 16% of the total broadband prescriptions. But we need more fiber in the backbone and backhaul, and that can be a problem. So this is our mobile penetration so it's still not 100%. And when it comes to subscriptions for mobile broadband and with a data plan, it's only density of 61 according to latest data of last quarter of last year. And so we need only, let's say, 75 million broadband subscriptions in mobile. But look at the diversity in So this is Chiapas. It's the worst in mobile broadband. Oaxaca is here, and Guerrero is here. So these 3 states are not as the lowest. Yeah, yellow is 81 to 100 penetration subscribers per 100 people, and red is 0 to 60. So there are municipalities which have 0 broadband because they only have deployed 2G networks, the huge operators. And the dark green is over 120, and it's basically Mexico City and surroundings. Now, competition-wise, well, as I said, we have a highly concentrated market for years, and it would take me a full day to explain why, but now this is what it is. America Mobile, the mobile company for the Slim group, almost 65% market share. AT&T entered the market and bought 2 mobile providers that were having really hard time in surviving, Nextel and Usacell, and so here it's a non-incumbent with 10.7% market share, and Telefonica with 23%. And now this is why who did, and so are concerned with this MVNO model. All MVNOs so far, buying infrastructure, capacity from these operators, only amount to 1.1% of the market. And there are these all, more like resellers, no? With Virgin Mobile and just offering mobile services with a different brand. They can't compete in prices because it's hard to beat someone that has 65% of the market share. They compete in services and plans and devices probably. But these are the current MVNOs. Now, traffic in 4G is still very low, but it's increasing more and more, and so are the 4G LTE networks that are being deployed as we speak for all 3 operators, but mainly AT&T and incumbent Telcel. But we need to make sure that these rural villages don't stay with 2G only. At least 3G they should have, the sooner the better. Oh, this is landline services, which may also demand some of the wireless capacity for certain purposes. And as someone said yesterday, that explains also why. Mobile has grown much more because no one, except for fiber to the home, if we're wise enough to encourage that market expansion, we will see deployments in fixed lines, but fiber. But that's what we have. And also the market share is concentrated. The incumbent Telmex 63 market share, and then we have in the landline a number of cable operators, and here the dominant cable operator that is also offering internet and voice is Televisa, which is the incumbent in broadcast content production. It has a large, it owns most of the cable companies, plus a satellite, very successful company, Sky, with all the satellite DTH. So, okay. Now, finally, spectrum. Yes, we had a huge deficit. We had only allocated 222 megahertz for many years. And, but so before 2014, that's what we had out there in the market. In only 2-3 years later, we have allocated spectrum up to 404 megahertz in all these bands, the 800, AWS, PCS, and also this 90 megahertz block for the wholesale open network that will be deploying LTE, or 4G network, offering capacity on a non-discriminatory basis to both mobile operators, why not fixed operators if they need certain capacity, and yes, MVNOs and MVNAs that could play an important role, these aggregators for the new coming services. That's my hope. I'll talk more about that with 5G. It's now being deployed in 4G, but it's going to be by design prepared to 5G when the time comes. And okay, so this is how our spectrum for mobile has evolved, and this is what we plan to put in the market next year. This is the 2.5 gigahertz band, which is really good for indoors and capacity rather than coverage. We are auctioning there 120 because 10 are guard bands, and the other 60 were bought by Telcel from another player. And we're also putting some more that's what it should look next year, okay? And so how has it been distributed in terms of operators? Well, these are the spectrum holdings considering all high and low bands. And well, considering that this company has 65% of the market and holds 38, well, it really needed more spectrum. It had the most subscribers per megahertz, as opposed to AT&T and Telefonica have much less subscribers per megahertz. But I don't think Telcel has been efficient because it has relied and make a lot of money for many years with 2G and 3G. Now, after AT&T came, and that's the wonder of competition. I mean, it's not like paradise, but now it's deploying 4G because the AT&T, of course, just came and is really rapidly deploying. And mobile market, and you mentioned it yesterday, Greg, had a ceiling for foreign investment before this reform, up to 49% foreign investment in mobile, only in mobile. But that changed, and as you can see, we're now two of our three operators are foreign, but trying to compete with the incumbent. And okay, so it's a bit more of where we put the spectrum. And there's all this technical, I'll leave this presentation and you're most free to publish it, of what standard we decided to go with for the 700. And the US was really surprised and not too happy that we decided to go with the APT 700, which we think it's very efficient, giving two FDD 45 megahertz blocks, uplink, downlink, instead of the US plan. But that also, the difference in standards poses significant challenges for the border zone, but we're working on it. And now, why we did this? Why put this star spectrum 700 in the hands of this PPP, which received the spectrum for free? I mean, it didn't have to pay for the spectrum in an auction. It competed for coverage. So the one who offered more coverage in terms of population, above 85%, was the one to get the contract. But there were infrastructure, entry barriers. And so we thought, well, sharing economy, infrastructure sharing, we need to bridge the digital divide in all these unserved locations that were never served by the market, and even worse when it was a not very competitive market. And so if that's a big issue, and if although the incumbent has opened access after our regulations to all its infrastructure and roaming and MVNOs, but still it doesn't have a really high-speed, super high-speed spectrum and network. So we thought this could make it much easier to compete in services without, and we passed special guidelines for MVNOs, and we have this array of different kinds of MVNOs with infrastructure, with some, with none, and they are free to work on their business models. Now, I do think that with 5G, there is a business case very different for MVNOs, very different to what we see now, just changing the brand. And as I'm sure Martin will explain, it's a whole different creature, 5G, and it does provide for customized and niche markets. It's not one size fits all, and we have to think of really disruptive MVNOs, providers of telemedicine, providers of multicast. Multicast will be a great thing. Providers for public security or safety, public security purposes for the government. They will have to form an MVNO and then provide critical mission services. But 5G allows you to have different service levels. And so it can be customized. So it will have nothing to do with what we know now as MVNOs. They will be, and aggregators will play an important role. But it will take time, yes. So it is a risky business, yes. But we really need to take risks and be disruptive and see changes. I mean, Mexico has been held back for decades after monopolies. These are the characteristics, but Judith went through them yesterday, and so this is what it is. They will be free to design their business plan, their rates, wholesale rates, just not discriminatory rates. They will have to be public, and they will have to reach in 7 years all this 92.2% of all the population, combining urban and rural. For every 1% of population covered in localities with more than 10,000 people, at least they have to cover 0.15% of people in localities below 10K. And so, well, I'll skip that. And this is what it looks like. A government entity that was created for this purpose, Promptel, was given a license for the spectrum. So IFT gave the license, and Promptel was allowed to lease the spectrum to the winner of the private-public partnership, which is Altan, and this would be it, for 20 years. And yes, it has a complicated scheme of investors and creditors, and it's a consortium, mostly foreign, with 2 Mexican companies. And this is about the 2.5 gigahertz band that will be auctioning this year. And as much as I would like to see coverage obligations there, but this band is more for capacity in urban areas. We're working on this. There's not much to say yet on how. If we need to have a clear and certain spectrum cap policy, and we're looking at it, because if Telcel, the incumbent, already bought 60 megahertz in this band, so to what extent it should be allowed to participate in this one, we're looking at this issue. And then we're rebanding the 800 megahertz bands to make it an IMT band, and just leave, after the full process, public trunking, broadband mobile services. Well, some of them are there already, and this has cellular band is already allocated to, I think it's AT&T, and so more public trunking, uplink and downlink. Right now it looks like this. There's commercial trunking and public trunking, but narrow band services, and we need to use it for IMT. And now also we are even ahead of time, because our first digital dividend came from the digital TV. We cleared the 700 band, and now we are in the process of clearing also 600 megahertz band. And we don't need an incentive action, by the way. We just, we will be relocating basically TV services to lower UHF bands, and we're coordinating with the US, but while they're get ready, and it will take, I understand, Ellie, I don't know, after this incentive action, it will still take like 7 years for them to be completely ready. We will be ready by the end of next year. And we have proposed this plan to ITU together with New Zealand, and they just, for the standard at the 600, and we received some reply saying that they have accepted this standards for segmentation plan, not standard, but the segmentation plan for the 600. So we'll be ready by the end of next year. And also, we are in a way already looking and acting upon more unlicensed spectrum and identifying more bands. This is the ones we have already for many years now as unlicensed, and we recently passed this as an unlicensed band, 60 gigahertz band for both outdoor and indoor uses, but I think we need more. And these are specifics. I won't go through that, but it will be there. How did the AWS auction go? And the difference, the result was 18 US dollar cents per megahertz pop, as opposed to we have a problem in Mexico. So the money for an auction, first, is not all that much. Our reserve prices are reasonable. But what the interested parties pays for the down payment in auctions is just about 20% of the cost of spectrum, because, and that's not within our powers, it's Congress which passes the laws for annual fees. And those amount over a 20-year period of time that lasts the license, that amounts for the 80% of the total cost. And it has different values depending the band, but that is a major problem. So we can design a wonderful spectrum policy, but the Congress can ruin it if it goes too high in annual fees. And we have that problem. We're preparing as now whether the nation should get money for the spectrum as opposed to allowing companies to make a rent. Yes, but it's not black and white. To what point? I mean, I don't want this spectrum cost to be a deterrent for capex, for investment in capital. And so I think we need to make a real good cost-benefit analysis as how would, if we convince Congress to lower all those annual fees, but in turn we put coverage obligations, and if not, they will have to pay again the fees. That could be a good incentive for deployment. And so our auction in this band gave us good information about what worked, what not. 10 megahertz were left out. No one took them, although the prices for this band were much lower at the end than international prices for the same. But it's, again, the annual fees that's they say killing them. GSMA is lobbying worldwide to eliminate almost all auctions or annual fees. And, well, I'll skip all this. Finally, the dynamic spectrum. Together with this research center we have at the Institute, we are planning for a deep, and here's where we connect the dots with you guys, a study on dynamic spectrum and options. And from what I learned, because I learned a lot yesterday here, well, we need to make all these pilots and tests, and where would it work, where would it not, for what bands. But there are all these options we have to seriously look into. RAN sharing, white spaces, simultaneous use of specific. We do have at our Telecoms Act this possibility of secondary use of spectrum. So what we could be doing is like, okay, Telcel, you got all the, or AT&T or Telefónica. So you have national licenses, but you are not covering 40% of the rural locations. Okay, we'll not even take that back, but we're going to issue secondary licenses that are subject to interference, but there won't be much because they are not using the spectrum in those mountains of Oaxaca, for instance. But they still have a license for the whole country. And so it's a very inefficient use. They used to have coverage obligation, but were really poorly designed years ago. And now the renewals come. And in Mexico, I don't know, we didn't discuss this yesterday, but once the license is over after 20 years, what do? We look at renewal. We never go back and auction again. So once you've won an auction, you probably stick to the spectrum forever if you have complied certain very minimum obligations that are a piece of cake. So we should have efficient use criteria to decide whether they have made efficient use, or say, okay, because you're not covering all these localities, because according to you it's a market failure, then I will issue all these non-commercial licenses. That could be an option, or just not even a license, just an authorization to provide certain services as secondary. But I don't know if that would be good enough because they wouldn't be protected from interference, the secondary uses. But you have to visit Mexico and you'll know what I mean. It's so isolated, some areas. And so we're already making all these questions, which are along the lines of your questions I heard yesterday. Where, how, with whom, the government's part, I found it fascinating. And we want to make sure that all this knowledge you shared, we start implementing it. And now I'm a bit worried about all these databases, the white spaces, but who will own it? Microsoft? That's what they want, no? Facebook, Google, I don't know. Shouldn't if that's going to be like the next essential facility, the big data and the database for white spaces, who should own it? Should it be, the discussion yesterday about Marconi? Is that I understand in the US, because these companies have the resources to manage the database, it is likely that it will be owned by Microsoft. Now, Internet of Things might change the picture. These are our only pre-Hispanic native dogs. They are called Xoloscuintles. They have no hair. They are a beauty. They are Aztec dogs. And they are already using, this is a picture I couldn't resist taking. It's dogs of friends of mine. They have their Fit Bark. It's a wearable. And she tracks it with an app. She tracks where they are, how much exercise they've done. And so these are Mexican Xoloscuintles with a 5G wearable. But beyond dogs and cars and other gadgets. The Internet of Dogs, yeah. That was the original title of the slide. It was kind of sounded roots, but yeah, the Internet of Dogs, and okay. But beyond all this really catchy gadgets, what's behind? And I'm leaving it to my fellow speakers now. But we have to think if 5G is so different, whether auction design will be key, or if we need auctions for that matter at all. Is it different players? I mean, would there be, or the usual suspects, or it's different? Like I want to be an operator for smart cities. So I want the spectrum, or I'll lease it. So I don't know. I don't know how efficient exclusive rights will be for all this Internet of Things and smart cities. Because of all this variety of short-range systems, wide coverage, narrow band, broadband devices, mission critical, different levels of service. And are we going to apply the same tools, the same paradigms for this, or a combination of all? Maybe that's the way to go. These are the bands that have been somehow recognized at last World Radio Communications Conference. Low bands for coverage, and then higher 3.34 gigahertz, and then even higher bands, but this will be discussed in 2019. And so urban, rural, anyway, but we need not to lose focus. We need inclusion and security, secure networks. It's being a deterrent, lack of trust in the networks, a lack of data, personal data protection and privacy. People are scared, and so that will be critical. And an efficient allocation. We can't afford to auction this and then learn that, of course, no one in the rural areas are using, or that it's not available, even if it would be wonderful for our agricultural industry and other industries. But maybe the 20-year exclusive license won't be the way to go. And it's already in our constitution that we have to auction commercial licenses, so that could be a problem. And so competition will be sufficient or not. And I would love to see new players, because these services are much more customized, but maybe they won't have economies of scale. So we have to just make sure that we can address these challenges of inclusion, of efficient use nationwide, and to increase access and investment in high-speed broadband, that we have enough backbone and backhaul and fiber, and that we have relevant content and Spanish language content and applications for our own needs. We are not as global as we have become in content through social networks. We still need local culture, local content. And so as I was mentioning yesterday, according to The Economist, this week's economy, these are the next 3 wars coming, and spectrum is second top of the list. But I see, are we going to use the same tools and weapons, not only to allocate the spectrum, but the competition rules should be revisited, because now the new monopoly will be who owns the big data. And if you don't have access to it, you will be in a great disadvantage if you cannot collect as much data as Google. No. So maybe the competition rules will have to change, and not the principles, but so there's a lot of work to do. Thank you so much. And final announcement, we launched 3 days back a very impressive information tool for researchers. It's called BIT, or BIT website, and it does everything. It's a robust database, and you can graphic and filter in it. It's very, very impressive, and we'll be loading it with more data as we gather it. But it's a whole new, I think, valuable tool for research. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. That was rich. I think there's a lot for us to dig into from that presentation. And again, I'm just so happy that we have the mix of academics and policy makers in the room. There was one line where you said, "Take risks, be disruptive." If we made T-shirts for this summit, I would have that on them right now. So we are open to questions. I know we're a little off the schedule, but the last event, last part of today is flexible, just in case of things like this, where it's simply too good to cut anything short. So, are there any questions? Yes. And please just, even though we know each other now, please just say where you're from for the TV audience.
Sure. Steve Song from the Network Startup Resource Center. Rhizomatica is such a remarkable example, but I think there's one big difference between 2G and everything else, in that you can run a 2G network on a VSAT connection sustainably. You can make a $3 as your ARPU and run a business, whereas the minute you go to 3G, 4G, data demand doesn't increase linearly. It increases exponentially. So immediately access to backhaul becomes the critical sort of barrier to affordable access. And I'm curious, in terms of strategy, is there a plan for opening up affordable access to fiber networks in Mexico? And maybe a follow-on question to that. I mean, you announced plans for the 2.5 gigahertz network and talked about spectrum use it or share it policies. Is there a chance that a use it or share it policy might apply to 2.5 gigahertz, which, obviously the operators are unlikely to deploy in rural areas? Sorry, long question.
Yeah. Thank you. First question. We have designed different tools to allow for access to not only the last mile, but also leased lines from incumbent. And so it's part of their asymmetric regulation burden. So they have not only to unbundle the last mile, whether it's copper or fiber, but also provide cost-based. We change from retail minus to incremental cost-based lease lines of incumbent. That provides a solution, but we need to do much more. And so we are studying all these options, maybe like fragmented studies. We're working, the spectrum unit represented here by Mr. Juan Pablo at the Institute is launching a complete holistic dynamic spectrum study. And so I will make sure they have all your names in the list, because there are, as you saw, different combinations of possibilities. Now, we also launched, I didn't mention this, a public consultation. It's now running for certain very low, but I think it wouldn't be backhaul. We're already implementing secondary use in certain bands and for certain devices, and because we are now facing a fact that there's all these cultural and sports events like Formula One, takes place in Mexico. They have more technology than driving skills of these racers. And so now they need like tons of connected gadgets for the Formula One. I said, oh my God, and what category is that? I'm not gonna give you a license to use it 2 days. Everything, the helmet, the telemetrics. So what kind of license is that? And so that would be subject like to this secondary use for in a given area and just for 2 days. And so all this machine-to-machine needs will have to change the picture of how we license or how we authorize use. A a specific project on backhaul. There's also this fiber network owned by the power company. I just read that there's a public consultation on how, and it would be important that community licensees like Rhizomatica give their vision and under what grounds and what cost model backhaul should be made available by this through fiber by the power company. Okay.
Okay, we'll have time just for a couple of questions, and I'll go to the back. So just please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. My name is Chang. I'm PhD student at the Department of Communications, Media and Film at the University of Calgary. So thank you for your interesting presentation. And my question is about the Internet of Things in Mexico. I have just been back to Vietnam for my field trip, and I interview policy maker in the country, and the person is so enthusiastic about Internet of Things for farming for in the country. And I also ask farmers about how broadband internet help them in their daily practices, and none of them mention anything regarding like automatizations thanks to internet. And also for my observations in the countryside, in villages, we have a garment factory, footwear factory where the intensive labor advantage is taken by the country. Yes, so what is your view on the future of Internet of Things for developing countries, and what is the status of Internet of Things in Mexico now? Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I'll run up here, sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah, oh, you're still mic'd. Okay, good, good, good.
Well, we're identifying, first of all, these bands, which bands, according to the last World Radio Communications Conference. So we've identified some. Then standards is a big question. Then I do think, and somewhere mentioned it in the presentation, there's this hype and wonderful, and the dogs and the cars and the smart cities and everything, but there has to be an ecosystem. And nowadays the ecosystem main pillars, I think, are secure networks, cybersecurity, otherwise, I mean, it's really scary. Second, yeah, high-speed broadband available, but also inclusion, because this could widen the digital divide for rural people, although they could really take advantage of it for agribusiness farms and you know, weather conditions and etc. I think to avoid the next generation of monopolies would be important. To have as much open software as possible. I will be working in a community of people, I think this is funded by European Union, working on what they call FIWARE. FIWARE is a platform, open source platform for Internet of Things, and where different stakeholders could just put their applications in that FIWARE. And and everything has to be compatible, but you know, the proprietary issues. Then a non-telecom issue, main issue for this to succeed is also liabilities. The whole legal system of civil liabilities and torts will be a major issue once the autonomous car hits someone, and so who's to blame for? So if cybersecurity and trust and secure networks and availability and compatibility and legal issues addressing when things don't go well are not addressed, and this is not my conclusion, this was a major concern at OECD ministerial last year in Cancun, that the digital economy depended, of course, on broadband, but also on all these issues that of trust, of secure networks, but also demands even more training and capacity building at the rural level will be necessary. And we need applications that are relevant and accessible to the local cultures. And there are different models, and so we will have to create an ecosystem where different models fit in, I think. Thank you.
We're thrilled with this last panel of the Canadian Spectrum Summit. We've got some of the real thinkers in this field who've been involved for some time, and we're extremely happy to have all three of these scholars with us, especially to have them sitting on one panel. We have Martin Cave with us today. Martin is an economist specializing in the regulation of the communications sector, including spectrum management. He's a visiting professor at the Imperial College Business School and is also inquiry chair at the UK Competition and Markets Authorities. His latest co-authored book with William Webb is Spectrum Management, published by Cambridge University Press. It sits on my desk most days. Linda Doyle is an associate professor at Trinity College, University of Dublin, in the Department of Electronic and Electrical Engineering. She received her PhD in 1996 and has been a faculty member since then. She's the director of CTVR.
Can I just interrupt you? That's a bio from about 10 years ago.
Oh.
Just skip it. It's okay.
It's the one I found.
I know, sorry, I thought I said you.
Okay.
Because none of those last few sentences are true, but that's okay. You can just say I'm here.
Linda Doyle's here. Are you still from Ireland?
I'm still from Ireland.
Okay, good. This was what I found. Well, she's done a lot of work in spectrum policy, and perhaps I have some dated data here. But Linda Doyle, we're really pleased to have you here today. Ellie Noam is a professor of economics and finance at Columbia Business School and is a Garrett Professor of Public Policy and Business Responsibility. He's the director of the Columbia Institute for Telecommunication, a research center focusing on management and policy issues in communications, internet, and media. Ellie has published over 30 books and 300 articles. His recent books and projects include Who Owns the World's Media from Oxford UP, Media Management, a 2-volume set that is forthcoming, and the project A National Initiative for Next Generation Video. Noam's advisory board memberships have included the federal government's telecommunications network, the Nexus Mundi Foundation, and the Electric Privacy Center, the Oxford Internet Institute, Jones International University, and committees of the National Research Council. He's a licensed radio amateur, advanced class, and a commercially rated pilot. So, this is our panel for this morning, and welcome.
I'm gonna have to make something up that sounds more interesting to go on a bio. But I promise I am Linda. And I'm very delighted to be here today, and thank you very much, Greg, and for inviting me. And I've already learned so much. My head is kind of buzzing with things. It's been so enjoyable. I noticed that the Canadians are trying to claim everything, so I thought I'd start the presentation by reminding people that Marconi, this is the west of Ireland, that Marconi, and Mark, we mentioned it briefly this morning, Marconi did a lot of transmissions from the west of Ireland, and this is an amazingly huge station that used to be there, and I actually have a little video clip, if anyone wants it, from a program called Coast by the BBC that looks at people trying to recreate that and the scale of it. As part of just a brief experiment. But I thought, going on your snow comments, we'd be actually, is it raining there? So we talk about the weather all the time as well. And I checked, and that would actually have cost 32 cents to send at the time of this. So there's all sorts of documentation about how much it cost and how the system operated. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'm mainly talking about open access wireless capacity markets, and I'm drawing from two papers. One white paper that I did with Peter Crampton, who is the economist. I'm the engineer in the scene, and we're actually going to also have this in telecommunications policy soon. But I also just wanted to flag up front, I wanted to mention the fact that Connect, that's the centre I come from, I'm a director of a centre called Connect. We work a lot with industry, and Rivada Networks is one of our collaborators in this project. I know it was mentioned yesterday, so I thought it would be a good idea just to let everyone know that this Rivada is our collaborator in this research as well. So, what do I want to talk about today? I really want to talk about the mobile network operator and MVNOs. And I think in one sense, we had a fantastic talk just before, which is really broad, and I'm going to dive into the details. But essentially, you set things up really well, thank you very much, in terms of issues around mobile network operators and MVNOs. And what I've tried to draw here is a kind of current situation where you might have a mobile network operator, it has its own customers. It might have its own kind of rebranded MVNO, and then there might be some other MVNOs, and I just put different diagrams in here. They might be for expats or something, or an MVNO for students or some other one. And this is a kind of traditional MVNO scenario. And kind of what we're really, really interested is kind of this situation where some MVNO really, really wants to expand. It's got great ideas, it's got huge scope, and this is what happens. Essentially, the mobile network operator doesn't want it because there's a conflict of interest. Why would you leave somebody erode your base and you kind of put a cap on its ability to work and to function? And because I come from the academic world, sometimes I kind of think, do I oversimplify these situations and kind of say, okay, that's how it is? But I was actually at an event called MVNO World Congress a few weeks ago, and I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of MVNOs. And time again, I got examples of where an MVNO maybe had a good idea, wanted to expand further, and because of this conflict of interest where you're sitting on an MNO network, that causes problems. And I think it's a conflict of interest that we really do need to deal with. And one of the things I learned brilliantly from yesterday was Mike Marcus's phrases of tatame and hone. And I've asked the EU Commission, what do you think of this? And they'll say, okay, we have instruments for dealing with competition. And I think there's this kind of, I want the truth to be that we're dealing with competition. But the reality is, if you look at a lot of MVNOs and the number in the world collectively and the number that go out of business regularly and the stories they have to tell, I think you can back it up that maybe the hone is different. So the other thing I think that's really interesting, and I think of this as a suitcase. So if you're packing your suitcase, there are some people who are really good at packing and they'll pack in lots more stuff. And when you think of mobile virtual network operators today, the way they tend to work, they work on the law of averages, where an MNO says, on average, I can fit 2 more in or 3 more in. But there's nothing dynamic and kind of there's nothing versatile. I think of it like a Tetris game. You're not kind of shifting and shaping and kind of fitting things in. And really, we're actually not exploiting the capacity that exists in a network that we could. And we can't even be sure that we're packing things in as well. So for me, I'm interested in kind of pure wholesale networks, but to me it matters the shape of the wholesale network. It's not that it's good enough to be wholesale in itself, it's the kind of wholesale network that it is. So I was very, very interested in the Commissioner's comments about the future, and I tried to put this in here as well. And I think if you look, so what I just showed you is the way MVNOs are today. And the way I often talk about those is they're like mini-me. So you have an MNO, and the MVNO in the main is like a mini version of the MNO. But in the future, and I think you did a really nice job of talking about the various different things, you might have different kinds of MVNOs. And for example, I put this in, supposing this is a rural area. So this could be a connected cow operator that just wants a rural area connectivity once a day. This could be a remote surgery operator that wants discrete locations for 3 hours to do an operation. And this could be a plain old coverage operator that wants all the time everywhere. So you have to think differently in terms of spatial and temporal, as well as thinking in terms of number of MVNOs and how they fit in and the kind of competition. So what we're very, very interested in, what would a wholesale network look like in the future that could accommodate the current situation as we know it now, but prepare us for the journey to the future that the Commissioner spoke about, of kind of the different kind of virtual network operators that are on the horizon. So this is some work I did years ago, and I'll try to explain it to you, and it is treating spectrum as a parcel, Ellie. So we looked years ago about this idea of fluid spectrum markets, and we divided spectrum into frequency, space, and time. And this is Ireland, and in fact, you know, so this could be a 2G license, and you have it forever, and I agree, if you have it for 20 years, you might as well have it for 10,000 years. And then you actually have to buy spectrum miles in advance before a market appears. So you might get your 4G spectrum, and the 4G market might only emerge there, and you still have to have it, and you have it for the whole country. So we were really interested in saying, okay, how could you allow a very fluid spectrum market emerge, where you could actually parcel it, and let's for the moment put the parceling thing aside of how you exactly do it, and allow the trading of that spectrum in a fluid way. And of course, what you would expect to happen is there'd be some aggregation, and you'd see some patterns that were similar to this, but and some would, you know, be for time, and some would be, you know, more in space, and you get different patterns like that. Obviously, of course, and I think it's an issue with any market, you could also have market failure, so you want to acknowledge that. But ultimately, when we wrote this paper, I wrote it with a colleague called Tim Ford. We spent all of our time talking about the interference issues that emerge, and this blurry diagram is supposed to conceptually say lots of problems with interference. So at the time, I was really into cognitive radio and software radio, and you know, I had all these kind of notions that that would solve the problem. You'd have these really intelligent radios that could do self-induced guard bands, that would understand what's next to them, would be able to do co-channel and adjacent channel interference in a clever way. If you dumb technology, you kind of had huge big guard bands. If you had smart technology, you had tiny guard bands, and would all work out. And essentially, I see this as a very purist view, and something that I was really motivated by. But what I'm thinking now, and the way I'm thinking more, is that, you know, I want that dynamism, but I'm going to give up some of the freedom, and the freedom I'm going to give up is I'm going to say it's spectrum plus infrastructure. And how can I be dynamic? In other words, what I want to take the ideas from naked spectrum, as Tom Hazlitt called it, and apply it to infrastructure plus spectrum and get this level of dynamism. And that's really what the kind of wholesale market type structure that we're interested in. So essentially, and I think what we're sacrificing, we're getting rid of these worries about interference by saying, okay, we're picking a technology and we're being dynamic on that technology. Okay, so that's kind of the background to it. So this then is essentially the summary of where it leads to. So it leads to trading capacity and not spectrum. So capacity is something that exists on infrastructure. Capacity should be bought and sold at different spatial and temporal resolutions. That's a really important thing, going back to the different kind of. And it leads to this notion of an open access market and dedicated wholesale. So a dedicated wholesale where you don't have that conflict of interest. An open access market where any player can, you know, big or small players, you can't be denied access to the market. And this kind of ability to work at a spatial and temporal basis that might suit your needs. Might suit your needs because you're a small player, or might suit your needs because you're a future virtual network operator. So that's the kind of space we were aiming for in this place. And that's why we then came up with this notion of, you know, we took LTE because it's a dominant technology around the world, and looked at treating that as a wholesale cellular network over which forward and real-time markets worked, and I'm going to explain those in a little bit. And essentially, we borrowed from the notion of the electricity market. So Peter, my colleague on this, is really knowledgeable about electricity markets and will be very involved in the liberalization of those, this notion of an independent system operator that oversaw this and essentially could feed back into the LTE network. So you could manage access on the basis of market share rather than on the basis of where the handsets were in the network. And the brilliant thing about LTE is that LTE is a fantastic standard in one way. And I kind of always think of it as a cognitive radio in hiding, because there's a huge number of hooks in the LTE standard that you can feed into. You can do any artificial intelligence or machine learning, and you can feed into a hook. A lot of vendors don't turn those hooks on. But what it does mean is that they exist, and with the existing technology, you can create this kind of a system that allows you to manipulate the LTE network to respond only. So if service provider B gets most capacity here, you give it to buys most capacity here, service provider B gets it. And if service provider A has bought more capacity here, service provider A gets it. So that's kind of how it works. So essentially, the reason why there's two kinds of markets, and this is to do with kind of risk, and it's also to do with price discovery and this whole notion that you don't actually have to regulate for how much this is going to cost. It will find it out itself. So the price discovery, so you need a forward market because most people don't want to wait till a real-time market and say, oops, didn't get any capacity, what'll I do with my... So what you allow people to do is kind of balance between a forward and a real-time market. I'll go back to this in a second. So in the open access market, capacity is bought in advance in the forward market. If too little has been bought in advance, is an attempt to get rid of it in the real-time market, or if too much has been, an attempt is made to get additional in the real time, and if too much, you attempt to offload it. And the really important thing, and it's kind of, the forward markets are financial instruments, so you can speculate on those forward markets. But if you speculate and have spectrum and you don't get rid of it, someone else will use it and you get stuck with the real-time price for it. So it's a fantastic mix of allowing the speculation that you might need to get the market going, but you actually can't hoard spectrum and sit in it and do nothing with it. Someone will use it in the end, and that's kind of the way it works. So essentially you have, you have a supply and demand curve, and basically you have a clearing price that the spectrum goes for, and that clearing price will be really low if there's no congestion on the network, and the clearing price will be higher if there's a lot of congestion. And essentially what you want to do is you want to force behavior as well. And I know this doesn't necessarily always work if you look at electricity. If the clearing price is really, really low at a particular time, you would hope that new entrepreneurs might say, okay, look, it's really, really low here. I will do something with the spectrum at this time. So I put this table here, and it might be a little bit hard to read from the back, but the reason why I put it in is because when you look at this, so I am giving up certain freedom by saying we're playing out this dynamism on a network, but essentially the time interval for the real-time market, which we've currently set as an hour, it could go down to much, much lower with the technology, but that's set at an hour. And the geographical area over which the real-time market applies, they're the only two things that are network dependent. Everything else is an economic decision: the duration of the forward market, the geographical area over which the forward markets apply, the type of auction used. And we've picked specific things as examples of the way this might work. But what I think you're just saying here is you're saying, I can be really dynamic and I can do lots of things, and only a small number of features are dependent on my network technology, and otherwise I can have this quite dynamic system. So you do things like this. You look a year ahead. We've decided to do 2 forward markets, a yearly and monthly forward markets, because that's kind of in the cadence of the way mobile operators think. So you can plan a year ahead and you can get spectrum for a year ahead over a very large geographical area. You can get spectrum for a month ahead over smaller geographical areas. And you might, so a year ahead, you might buy a certain amount and you might adjust things a month ahead. And this makes sense. You can imagine, for example, if this was a region, and this was we'll say a city centre, and in the summer they'd loads of extra tourists into that city centre, you might need more capacity, and you might say, okay, the suburbs don't need as much, or something like that. So it's very important. And the other thing that I think is really, really interesting, I read a statistic from a company called Real Wireless that mobile operators typically 30% over provision their own networks. So if you start to stand back and think that every individual mobile network operator, other ones existing, would no longer need to 30% over provision their network and dip into a pool. And I know there's some issues with correlation of demand, but you could start to think a little bit differently about how things might work there as well. So you you go down and you refine it right down to the real time, you make the final adjustments. And we have, this is just an example of the kind of, you'd have your yearly auction, your monthly auction, and your hourly auction, where hour, in this case, is what we equate with real time. But as I said before, you can reduce that with the technology. So we have all sorts of examples of this at work, and in this particular case, there's 7 bidders, and the 7 bidders are aggregated, and here is the demand curve, and here's the supply curve, and here's the clearing price. And there's lots of documentation online that shows kind of examples of this working and how it might work out. So that's the kind of the rough idea of it. So I'm nearly at the end, and I just want to step back and talk about this a little bit more generically, because I think there's 2 really kind of ideas that matter. So the first thing is that I can think of bringing my own spectrum to this. So I can have a network, we'll say the grey network, and I have permanently available spectrum on it. But I could also temporarily put on this market additional resources. So for me, a network is a pool of resources that are kind of performed into existence as they're needed. That's how I think about networks. So this pool may be augmented or not, depending on what other spectrum's available. And the example I've given here, suppose you got extra 2.3 gigahertz spectrum from licensed shared access framework, or you got prioritized spectrum from an auction from the 3.5 gigahertz band for 4 months or something. They could go into that market. Now, I'm being very flippant here in a way because, you know, all spectrum isn't fungible and you can't just dump any spectrum onto any network infrastructure. But in principle, I think you can begin to think this way, and there can be situations that allow that fungibility and that suit it. So that's the first thing, bring your own spectrum. The second thing is bring your own network. And I think this is increasingly important. And I was really delighted yesterday there was so much emphasis on infrastructure, because I think when you look especially at 5G, one of the exciting things for me in terms of, and I put it like this, smashing the power of the incumbents, is that it is no longer possible to own all the infrastructure you need to own. So when you start to think of dense urban environments, or you start to think of Internet of Things, you can't own all the small cells on a university campus or in a hotel. You can't own every lamppost that exists for your IoT deployment. So it's increasingly the case that multiple entities is going to be fragmented ownership of all of this stuff. That does not stop you having a kind of what I'm called a cooperative of networks. And I was speaking to a woman called Cynthia yesterday who's from a legal background and interested in kind of cooperatives. And I think there's all sorts of interesting things to think of, like one wholesale network is not one owner. And I think there's different ways of kind of bringing your own network to bear into this pool as well. So bringing your own spectrum and bringing your own network, I think, and especially small cell as a service and neutral host and all those ideas that are emerging are really, really important in this context. So then I'm just going to make a final comment, and the final comment is a little bit complex because I'm using this graph to describe it, the final comment. So I was involved in an EU project last year where we were trying to gauge the socioeconomic value of 5G. And it's really, really hard to do. And you know, we did lots of interviews and lots of focus groups as well as kind of looking at techie stuff. But one of the things we did is we looked at all of the 5G projects that are ongoing in Europe, and we said, okay, if these were to come into fruition, here are all the kind of connectivity that people would need. And this is for a motorway use case. And we looked at, like, supposing you had a motorway and you had an intersection and you had X number of cars and Y percentage of them were connected cars and Z percentage had people looking at entertainment in them. And you looked at what connectivity they needed, sub 1 gigahertz, between 1 and 6, and above 6 gigahertz. And you thought, and I always dispute this, you dealt with that, we have 4 operators. And you said, I have 4 operators in a country. Europe seems to be obsessed with the number 4. I know I have been asking you about this, Martin. But essentially, if 4 operators existed and there was no sharing, there is not enough spectrum in the world to deliver the connectivity that they needed. And you have to get them 100% sharing to absolutely get to a point where there's reasonable spectrum, and that's still a huge amount of spectrum. And when we showed this to the EU Commission, they said, we're not publishing that initially because they didn't believe it, and they made us go back and double check everything. And we said, okay, this is based on the work that's being done in Europe, so you have to believe it. But what I ask myself is, what does 100% sharing mean? And what does that look like? And how do we get there? And this is for 2025. And for me, kind of new ideas about wholesale are one step in that direction. I'm not saying they're the be-all and end-all, but wholesale that's truly independent wholesale that's dynamic, wholesale that actually has something like these kind of market mechanisms to get what you need, wholesale that allows you to learn your demand curve. And that's the really interesting thing about these open access markets. They actually force you into understanding and trying to kind of understand your own demand and you refining it. And there's penalties actually if you don't get your demand right. So wholesale like that is one step on the approach to this, whatever 100% sharing might eventually look like. So thank you for your time, and
that was. Goodness me. Well, as in broadcasting, I'm just going to interpose a brief commercial break here because Linda put up a slide which showed a paper which she published in Telecommunications Policy, which is in fact one of 16 papers on spectrum that are coming out, most of which are already on the website. They're edited chiefly by Jock Given, who's at the Swinburne Institute of Technology, but I played a small part in it. And the papers are organized into papers on auctions, sharing, governance, and case studies. I think, in fact, that has something in common with the classifications de facto that we've got here. But I must confess rather ruefully that, quite honestly, I think that the stuff that Catherine and Greg has managed to put together is rather more quirky and innovative than what we have. On the other hand, if you want to look at a broad range of things, that's one thing that you might do. Okay, I'm going to try and answer the question, how disruptive is 5G? This is, in fact, a very simple and speculative paper, and it's very 2017 in the sense that you can insert your own alternative facts into it to work out what's going to happen. I should say it's written with my friend and colleague William Webb, who's an engineer, and he has separately, on his own responsibility, written a book which you may find very interesting, which is called The Myth of 5G. The gist of which is, I think, that to put it rather reductively, 5G may not actually be quite what you think it's going to be, depending what you think it's going to be in the first place, of course, which is pretty much a movable feast. At the same time, various parties, particularly equipment manufacturers, operators, and those of us who service the needs of the sector from the academic community, do have a kind of tendency or temptation to talk it up for various reasons. And then some of our regulators, thus deceived, although I exclude Adriano from this criticism, may then act in ways which might necessarily not be entirely in the public interest, and neglect alternative, much cheaper things such as Wi-Fi and things like that, which might otherwise happen. He's exhibited a fair amount of bravery in doing this, I'm bound to say, because his hypothesis is that most people will try and rubbish the proposition, and that certainly attempt has been made quite widely. But I'm not necessarily committed to his views, although I don't necessarily disagree with them. So I'm just going to just set out an alternative form of analysis which might suggest that 5G is in fact capable in certain circumstances of being quite highly disruptive of industry structure. And my starting point is the claim that ever since the mobile industry started, it has been extraordinarily stable in the way in which it's organized. The number of firms has been pretty constant, fewer in the 80s and 90s, rising, a bit of consolidation taking place now. It's the same kind of firms doing the same kind of thing. There've been a progression through various generations, 1, 2, 3, and 4, now 5. It used to be voice, now it's data. But if you look at the way it's arranged, if you look at the degree of vertical integration within the sector, it hasn't actually changed very much. Now, for people interested in industrial organization, that's a very annoying situation because you don't observe variation. And I also suspect, building on our discussion yesterday about tight oligopolies, that it's not necessarily a pretty good deal for consumers, firms and households, because the firms tend to fall into patterns of behavior. They recognize each other's likely reactions. They anticipate them. You end up with brakes on innovation. You end up with the maintenance of prices, which may be higher than is strictly necessary. And that's really bad for consumers. So it's an interesting question from a consumer's point of view, I think, as well as from the point of view of people who are interested in industrial organization. So let me begin with the first question. What is 5G? And this really is the crux of it, because basically we don't really know yet. I mean that partly in the sense that the process of standardization hasn't taken place, but that's rather a narrow interpretation of the scale of our ignorance. The broader interpretation of the scale of our ignorance is that we know that 5G is capable of enabling a whole bunch of different things. It's probably going to enable them progressively, and since some of them will be pretty new, we don't know what their consequences will be. And I have here a quotation from a guy at the standardization agency in Europe, ETSI, and what he's saying is quite plausible, I think, that initially the focus is going to be what we've got at present, 4G, only slightly better and cheaper and more efficient, that is mobile broadband, and that the next stage thereafter will be the fantastic new stuff. And he describes in this ultra-reliable, low latency and massive machine-type communications. And the one will be available sooner than the other because basically it's what you'd expect. It's by no means unfamiliar. Okay, now, what is also clearly the case is that 5G will spread gradually. And there's going to be a great deal of spatial and temporal variety in the way it's deployed and then developed. And what I propose to do here is to crystallize this rather artificially into two variants. The first variant is the limited one, where 5G actually turns out to be pretty much like a better version of 4G. The focus is on mobile broadband, and not much else happens. Okay? But there is, however, the more interesting expansive version, which I'm going to focus on, because that's the circumstance which it seems to me is more likely to lead to the kind of industrial disruption which I secretly crave. Okay? Now, what that would mean, if it occurred, is that there would be ubiquitous, massive communications capability available, and that would be associated with an enormous step change in the digitization of all aspects of activity, social activity, economic activity, public sector activity. Illustrations of this might be connected cars, which I'll talk about more later on, advanced manufacturing, e-health, just to give three illustrations which show a combination of household demand and derived demand in industry capabilities, and also, at least in most of the countries represented here, a combination of public and private sector activity. Each of these is subject to its own business case, and that's the one which I really want to concentrate on, because I think that's the interesting one. Now, I've just got a very quick quotation here from an official at Verizon, who clearly believes in the expansive version, and you can see that in the middle paragraph. It says it won't be a wireless evolution; it will be a wireless revolution. Now, if on the other hand you talk, as I do, in a rather random and an occasional way, to people who are giving investors advice upon what the impact of 5G is, you often find a much less optimistic point of view, because basically their proposition is, in order to achieve this mass ubiquitous connectivity, there has to be massive investment. The massive investment can only be justified by substantial incremental revenues. And are we certain that the demand is there in order to elicit those massive incremental revenues? So a question which I'm going to duck is the question, which of these versions is going to take place? And I'm ducking it partly because, again, this isn't a kind of binary issue. What will happen is that initially, certain areas will be subject to 5Gization, which is also known, as we'll see in a moment, as densification. Okay? If you're a country about as big as a tablecloth, like Singapore and Hong Kong, then maybe that'll be just about the whole of the population. If, on the other hand, to take the extreme end, opposite end of the spectrum, you're talking about Alberta, then it's probably fair to say that large parts of it will not actually be much touched by this for a very considerable time and possibly forever. So we aren't really talking about anything other than a gradual process of expansion, as has occurred with 3G, 4G, et cetera, but for the purposes of the impact on industrial structure, I propose to treat these as alternatives. And here I'm relying upon a paper which is written by my colleague at a think tank in Brussels, with which I am associated, called Walter Lemstra. Okay, now, what are the implications of a radical 5G for spectrum management? Well, I think we discussed this very interesting session yesterday morning, And I think it's probably fair to say that the main implication is going to be the further withering away of exclusivity of licensing. I mean, as I think Linda indicated in her last slide, we really will have to have access, if the expansive version of 5G is implemented, to a very considerable amount of spectrum. It's going to be impracticable from a governance point of view to kick the existing occupants out, especially if they include the US Navy and other very well-armed groups of society. And this will mean that the sharing is going to be the name of the game. And we discussed yesterday, and I won't bother to go through this again, the various forms of sharing that might be contemplated, and they basically fall into two categories: license sharing, rules-based sharing, and interesting enough, combinations where you have some potential users governed by licenses and some potential users governed by rules. So the European version of licensed shared access, everybody is licensed, but they're in a hierarchy of users. Okay? In the rather interesting 3.5 case in America, which we talked about yesterday, I understand there are likely to be various categories of licensed operators, and there's going to be a third category of what we might call in English odds and sods, who are able to come in and use any stuff that might be left over. Now, I don't think we really know enough at the moment to work out which of these things work at all and which of them work best. And so one of the learning requirements of the expansive version of 5G is we'll have to work out a whole lot more about that, so we know actually what's going on. So I won't say anything more about that since we've already looked at it. But let me, first of all, though, second of all, anyway, talk about what the implications of an expansive version of 5G would be for the radio access network. And I think that the key point here is that if it's envisaged that we're going to have to use much higher frequencies, then the physical network which underlies it, particularly the network of base stations, connection points, is going to have to change hugely. I mean, if you're using millimeter spectrum, you have to have a base station not every 5K or something like that. You have to have a base station every 200 meters. These are just entirely illustrative figures, and the real ones are obviously quite different. So this is where densification comes in. And that really is going to be a huge cost. Now, in Asian countries, according to New Street Research, which is a financial analysis firm which has done a lot of this, analysis of 5G, New Street Research claims that Asia is already endowed with a much, much larger number of base stations than Europe and the United States. And that makes them much better placed, actually, to introduce at a much lower incremental cost 5G. What's going on elsewhere is that, predictably, in Europe we have a 5G accent plan which is based upon harmonization and very substantial public sector intervention, whereas in the United States, particularly since the arrival of the new regime at the FCC, there's an even greater focus upon competition in access to spectrum as being the means of ensuring a quick implementation. Okay, now there's one aspect of that which I probably should have said something more about, which is really bearing upon the last bullet point. There is, as most of the people in this room would already know, and probably most of them are better equipped to understand, it's an engineering issue rather than an economic issue, a series of massive changes which is going on in the organization of networks. These are captured by the phrases software-defined networking and network function virtualization. And the implication of that is that a given network can be controlled in real time, well, not quite in real time, but progressively, to provide a variety of different heterogeneous services in a way which traditional networks, which were built entirely upon hardware that was provided by a vendor, weren't capable of adaptation in the same way. And this leads people to talk quite extensively about network slicing. The same network capability can be sliced in different ways to meet different requirements. And once you have networks which are capable of network slicing in that fashion, it introduces the possibility of what has been described as multiple tenancies on the same network. They can be used for a range of different things. Now, this process of virtualization affects both fixed and mobile networks, but in application to mobile networks, it introduces the possibility that a radio access network can be sliced to provide a variety of different services, meeting the requirements of different groups of users. Those users often being described as verticals, health, automotive, et cetera, and at the same time, there's nothing to stop other radio access networks coming into existence, just as the way as the Internet of Things has actually elicited entirely new and separate networks in order to provide these services. So, on one hand, the effect, as far as the RAN is concerned, would be to make much greater requirements on it, which are likely to have the effect of increasing costs. Increasing costs means the benefits of network sharing, especially base stations, become much more prominent. That network sharing can go the next mile and turn into mergers between them and the reduction in the number of RANs. At the same time, there may be the possibility to introduce alternative radio access networks to provide other specialized services. So it's the world that has existed over the past 20 years of one MNO, one RAN, roughly the same thing, the same level of service, is likely to change quite radically. And this leads me on to effectively my last slide, which was what impact might this have upon horizontal and vertical integration within the industry. Okay. Now, what I'm suggesting is that in relation to radio access networks, there's likely to be more sharing and concentration, and there may be additional entry meeting other heterogeneous requirements. In relation to combinations of core networks and RAN networks, again, there's going to be the same kind of thing, with both slicing going on, both in the core network and in the RAN network. There's no reason why the RAN provision might not actually be separated from the provision of the core network. At the moment, MNOs provide their own core network and their RAN. If fixed operators increasingly enter the core network, and other parties do, then the mobile networks might be pushed back into a kind of ghetto consisting entirely of basically being a dumb pipe for the transmission of radio signals. And then let's think a little bit more about these verticals that come into existence as a result of increased digitization. I've given a number of examples, the automotive one, the health one, the advanced manufacturing one. Let's see what happens when they're in the picture. What kind of requirements are they likely to have for the provision of mobile communications? Well, obviously they're going to differ. In an automotive context, you might need very low latency. In a health context, if it's just simply monitoring somebody's heart condition, it might be very low basic occasional transmissions, rather like transmissions which come from a smart meter in the energy sector. And so that will occur. But the point about these new activities, verticals, and let's take again the examples of automotive and health, is that the service that's being provided isn't au fond necessarily a communication service. In transport, it's a mobility service taking you from A to B. In health, it's keeping you well. And so a consumer would not necessarily think that the logical person to bill him or her for a health service, looking after that person's health, conducting operations where necessary, and a bit of monitoring thrown in. They wouldn't expect the provider of the communication service to bill for all those services. The natural person to bill would be the government health service or the health management organization, whichever it might be. And ditto with cars. So there's a kind of struggle going on in the automotive industry in connection with connected cars. I'm not talking here about autonomous vehicles, which are self-driving, but things like indications of where you are, communicating with people in other vehicles, recording data so that if you're using a usage-based insurance, it's quite clear what the bill you have to pay, how long the car's actually been on the road. All those kind of sort of connected car things is an arena of struggle between three types of companies, each of which wants to have the connection with the consumer, because it's having the connection with the consumer which enables you to exploit the consumer's notorious weaknesses, which we talked about yesterday, namely an ability to be hopelessly confused by very complex pricing regimes, and the rents for that are what these people are struggling for. So you have tech companies, car companies, and mobile operators trying to get hold of those rents. Now, if an organization other than the mobile operators succeeds, then what you're looking for then is to use the buzzword of quite a lot of this, we're looking for expansion of MVNOs. They will go around, they'll buy at wholesale the communications, they will then sell the retail service to the customer, and that is something which is likely to diminish the role of the mobile operator in the process. So what are the regulatory implications of this? Well, you might have to worry about regulating fewer RANs more carefully, because the prospects for collusion amongst them to raise prices would be more substantial. You might want to maintain pro-competition spectrum awards policies too, doing so. You'd be worried about the existing gatekeepers, namely the mobile operators, basically making life very difficult for anybody who's trying to come in, for example, by refusing to grant MVNOs to such parties, foreclosing them in other words. You'd have to worry a bit about mergers and acquisitions that might go on in the sector. AT&T, for example, as long ago as 2012, spent over $600 million buying a connected car company. And so, they know what they're doing. But apart from that, in my view, these developments are disruptive in a way which is potentially quite good for consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Just one thing. Well, this is great. In fact, Martin and I kind of complement each other. I think I'm a little bit more optimistic here. But we didn't even talk about this, but we should. So thank you very much, Greg and Catherine, for bringing us together here at the University of Calgary. What a great conference, great speakers. We had these great regulators. We heard them here today, and and great talks. So. Wireless is not my main passion, but it was my first. That got me to the subject. I was a kid and I was a radio amateur, and so we did the kind of we drove around or drove in our parents' cars with a 2-meter type of rig, and there was nobody else who could actually do mobile communications unless you had a 4 or 5-star general or something like that. So we were really great. Now, of course, everybody does it. It's really great to return to my first love here. I told Greg that I end up talking about wireless in Antarctica, but actually I will talk about a much more forbidding, cold, and hostile environment, namely Washington, D.C. And of all the topics, of all the communications topics in Washington, none is worse than net neutrality. And the issue is on the agenda. The FCC is poised to vote on the subject next week to put this on an NPRM, notice of proposed rulemaking, on the agenda in order to give people their last cigarette before the execution. So this has been And as this has been going on, I would ask myself, isn't there some better way instead of this debate here? So this is kind of consider this to be a bit of a head-scratching exercise here, relatively preliminary, and I hope that you will give me some feedback. Now the subject, all right, so here we are. This is a demonstration in favor of net neutrality. It's probably one of the more polite ones. And here you have some of the cartoons that basically present this issue as there's broadband, kind of equal lanes, but now suddenly they will be kind of limited. And here's the same idea of the that there are these companies that are trying to cut this off, and here's the same idea. Comcast, Verizon, AT&T are circling Congress with their kind of laser beams, and so there's much more to it. So now there are kind of good counter arguments too, but let's see how the regulators proceeded, which is a kind of a bit of a nostalgic historical journey, which starts with Chairman Charles Ferris, but actually Michael Marcus right here was the person who authored the distinction between regulated and unregulated information services, regulated telecom services for packet switched data, and the FCC then kind of classified these packet switch services, which is now what ISPs do, as regulated. So that was the classification. Now we get to the second step, which is a reclassification. Michael Powell, FCC, classified or reclassified broadband services as information services. That was certainly a bit of a stretch, but that kind of stuck for about 15 or so years with modifications. His successor, Kevin Martin, pardon? Here's what. Yeah. Right. Powell is the head of the Cable TV Association. Martin is with Facebook. So he expanded the reclassifications also to cable, and that went to various courts, and kind of the FCC was upheld, and also established some open network principles. And now kind of the first Democratic under Obama chairman of the FCC expanded this still further to with principles of open network order. So it was more than principles. It was order. It was tighter and so on. But agitation was going on all the time. And then under his successor, Tom Wheeler, the idea was at first kind of that they would do pretty much the same thing, just a little tighter. Then there was public agitation of various kinds, around the country, which led to President Obama basically saying this is how it's going to be. And the FCC, although an independent agency, did move then in the direction of the president. This was here the FCC's vote meeting, so you can see that there was some kind of strong feelings of people going in there. And so the FCC under Chairman Wheeler then decided to reclassify. This became also then subsequently complicated by the emergence in wireless of so-called zero rating, which means that towards the data cap, 200 megabytes or whatever, the certain things would not be counted, such as video provided by certain information providers, such as vertically integrated ones. And so this thing clearly became more complicated. And now we have a new chairman, former commissioner, Ajit Pai, who has now proposed is pursuing a reclassification. And that has also led to, as you can expect, strong feelings. So for example, his opponents have been picketing his neighborhood, and every house in the neighborhood now got these things, got these leaflets there that read his kind of he has age 44, height, weight. He's a former Verizon lawyer, he now runs the FCC, where he's trying to destroy net neutrality by giving cable companies the power to control content on the internet. If you want to keep the internet open and equal access for all, then et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so as you can see, there are hard feelings here. And I was wondering, is there a way to end these religious wars? Because clearly there's going to be a democratic FCC sooner or later, and so they will regulate this in some fashion, and there has to be some kind of an easier way to proceed. And so let's try to remember important things. The classification is really a tool, it's not a goal. Why get people getting so hung up on this? The goal is a free and unrestricted flow of communication. And the strategy to achieve this is by eliminating the gatekeeper power of intermediaries, in particular of the ISPs, but not only the ISPs. So is there possibly a way to get to overcome these bottlenecks in other ways? So the policy prescriptions that have been essentially been talked about is either kind of to do nothing and rely on market forces. Now, to believe that that's going to happen require us to suspend the belief that a duopoly will kind of act like a perfectly competitive market. But what's the point of becoming a duopolist if you can't behave like one? The second option was basically what the FCC had done, which is to say, well, if there's a problem, if you misbehave, then we're going to go after you, but we're not going to establish elaborate rules yet. Then there's the more European approach of the unbundling, and that works certainly in particular where you have a monopoly pipe, such as a telecom without cable. So there's a monopoly, not even a duopoly. And then there's common carriage regulation, net neutrality, basically it's common carriage, or a government-run common carrier, which is perhaps more the Australian type direction. So these last three options involve permanent regulatory intervention. And the problem with the common carrier approach is that, personally, I think that almost this one, a structural solution or a separation, total separation of content provider and applications provider from the network, structural solution is probably more workable long-term than the common carrier regulation. The problem with net neutrality is that its advocates have no sense of history here. And so they typically don't recognize that they're in fact advocating common carriage if they even know what it is. And they don't understand often what the problems with this are that are emerging. Now you can say, we're going to deal with these problems in certain ways. You can say that we're going to accept the problems, but often there is not even a recognition that there's an issue. Now, I was a state commissioner for New York, public utility commissioner for 3 years. We did common carriage regulation all day long. And one thing that I can tell you from my own experience, having seen how that sausage gets made, is that you as the regulator can reach any result you want to. Okay, that is to say, it's a bit like the story about the accountant. You say, how much is 2 + 2? And she answers, well, how much would you like it to be? And so this, in this context, what troubles me here is not so much that suddenly somehow that companies will have power, not power, but rather that regulators will have power, essentially to have an enormous discretion in the communications area where you basically don't want government to have too much discretion, to affect how companies and how competitors and how vertical and horizontal things will work. This is a problem. Now you can try to solve it, but there's possibly other ways to do it. And what might that other way be? Oops. Ha. Wireless to the rescue. Now, wireless has historically has kind of, as it has progressed, become more powerful, has become a more potent competitor, alternative to other means of communication. So at first, it was a more means communications for other mobile communications that were inferior then to voice telephony. So many people today don't even have a wire line anymore. They just kind of use their mobile phone because it has become powerful and cheaper and convenient, et cetera, et cetera. Now, next is the with smartphones, kind of there emerged at first a kind of fairly potent narrowband broadband. So you can use it for internet access, email, all kinds of stuff, plus the various apps that are fabulous, that are even better than what you get on the internet. And so it's become a real powerful potential. And now, as it becomes even more powerful, it is becoming a real alternative to broadcasting and cable, as well as to broadband, internet broadband communications. Now, it is true that, and this is a bad graph, but basically it shows here the speed over time in terms of megabits, kilobits, etc. over historically, and this is wireless, roughly, and these are some wireline. And you can see that there's an enormous capacity speed increase, but it's also true for wireline, fiber, etc. So there's always kind of a gap. The gap of an order of magnitude, maybe 1, maybe 2, 10 times, 100 times, 50 times, and that's probably going to stay. But the question is, so it's...
The US? I'm sorry. Is this in the US?
That's technology. That's technology. But the point is not whether wireless is ever going to be as fast as wireline. No, it's never going to be, but rather, is it good enough? Okay, because obviously, cars, they can go faster and faster and faster, but at some point it doesn't really make all that much of a difference, right? So this is the question here. So now comes the issue of how can this affect the broadband provisions, making it more competitive. We do have these number 1 and 2, which is the current duopoly, telecom, wireline, and cable companies. And now we're talking about some countries like Canada, like the United States, like some European countries, but not all. I mean, like there's no cable really in Italy, for example. There isn't very much cable in Japan. And so in many countries you basically have a kind of much more of a monopolistic one. But let's say duopoly. But now you have the possibility of, in the US now, Verizon, mobile. AT&T, mobile, Sprint, and T-Mobile. So now I say, hey, wait a moment, we got now possibly 4 more, 6. But it's and AT&T, in fact, has kind of now also started. There's that 5G types, 5G Lite that they are doing, which is called experimenting, which is called pre-5G or 5G Lite or LTE-A, that AT&T is calling Evolve, LTE Evolve. Martin, this is why the Verizon guy, the competitor to AT&T, says we're not doing evolution, we're doing revolution, because AT&T's trade name for this is Evolve. All right. The problem with these things is, however, that they are not truly all that much of an alternative. First, because Verizon and AT&T are what Dwayne Windsor calls the diagonal competitors. They're basically kind of both in wireline and wireless. Not necessarily in the same territory, but they're kind of like they're not going to be nasty to each other. And so, or horizontally to their own operations, wireline, wireless. Similarly, so that's the horizontal one. Similarly, even more so of a problem is the vertical, because many of these companies are vertically integrated. AT&T owns DirecTV. Maybe they will own Time Warner and cable, which is going to be interesting because President Trump said, candidate Trump says no, but the FCC seems to be saying yes. So we'll see how that works out. The cable ISPs such as Comcast owns NBC Universal, and maybe they will also own, rumors that will own Sprint from the Japanese, will sell it to Comcast. And then Verizon owns Fios, etc. So these are vertically integrated, plus the net zero stuff, which means that when you do it on wireless mobile company platforms, AT&T will basically say, yes, you have a cap 200 or whatever, but if you using the Time Warner channels or the DirecTV package and your DirecTV then subscriber, in effect, it doesn't count. And that gives them enormous competitive advantage over others. So therefore, I conclude that as useful as these competitors are, most of them really are not going to be heavily competing because the only one that is more like a pure play is T-Mobile. And T-Mobile is actually not a pure play in other countries. They just happen to be in the United States a pure play. It's Deutsche Telekom. But there are possibilities of changing this now. Okay, and that is the emergence of these small, inexpensive nodes that will lead to different architecture. And 5G is just one example. So you have these things here that you just can put on the utility pole, on the light pole, on the utility pole, on the window, that are relatively inexpensive and make it possible to create these small microcells, picocells, not just these larger cells, and making it therefore possible to have relatively powerful communications, broadband speed type communication streams into people's homes and offices, to the point that even Google, and I'm sure you all heard about Google, the gigabit network, fiber, and all that stuff, but the reality is Google has stopped doing that because even Google doesn't have enough money. So instead, they're now exploring and experimenting with doing this wirelessly. So the last mile or so would become wireless. And so you could conceivably have something that looks a bit in that fashion. Here's the network, and it's comprised of 3 or 4 segments. There's the last mile edge network. There's the backbone backhaul network. Then there's the internet core, and all the way at the end are the content providers. And between the home and the backbone, right now we just have cable and telecom. But we can think of in the future of very near future of getting kind of close to the utility poles or light poles in the neighborhood, provided by a whole set of companies, some of them established, some new, some local governmental types, that in turn get connected to, by way of backhaul to the core internet network. Now this part is still somewhat of a bottleneck situation, but much less so because first, these independent neighborhood nodes can be wirelessly connected to other backhaul providers, including their own, so that there could be alternative ways of reaching the core internet, but it's something that clearly needs to be watched and modified and controlled so that there would not be shifting the bottleneck from the local to the backhaul. But I think the backhaul is an easier problem to resolve. So some of the ways to do this are, well, let me see here. There's unlicensed, let's start with unlicensed spectrum. The unlicensed spectrum comes in at least two categories. White space is an LTE, U, which stands for unlicensed. These things, they operate on different frequency ranges. We're getting here very quickly into somewhat of a geek territory. But basically, you can go at a relatively medium speed, which is the white space television spectrum that is being opened and liberated, etc. 700 megahertz. So that's a relatively medium speed, or you can go to Wi-Fi speed, which is about 2.5 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz, or you can go to high-speed millimeter waves above 30 gigahertz per second. So you can choose different. I mean, I could choose. There are different alternative spectrum frequency ranges. Then there is the power, and that in turn the combination affects the speed, affects whether it can penetrate walls, whether it can pass through snow, and important in Canada, rain, etc. So there are all kinds of variations. But in some ways, I find this is interesting and important to a bunch of network engineers. The rest of us have for all of you who answer that description, we have such faith in you guys. You're going to solve these problems. So then the next step, however, the other step, however, is it licensed or unlicensed? And so the white space regime of the FCC include a lot of unlicensed categories. And into that unlicensed categories, people, in particular Microsoft, were proposing and pushing something called super Wi-Fi, which is at a higher range, but kind of more power, kind of transmission, and so you can have a wider range, faster throughput of speed. And so in particular, Microsoft has pushed this around the world as an alternative access technology. Then there is the LTE-U, unlicensed, which think of this as a kind of 5G light type direction, unlicensed, and the FCC, this is one of the first things, in fact, Ajit Pai did, was to authorize the use of LTE-U. Now, the interesting thing is, though, this is not only unlicensed, but it would also be used by licensed carriers such as Verizon, such as AT&T, in fact, who plan to do this. So they will, ironically, after arguing for years against unlicensed spectrum and all this chaos that's going to emerge, now they say, wait a moment, why don't we use it when we need it? So it might be unlicensed, but hey, we're going to use it just as much as everybody else. It's just that we're bigger. There's a good chance that, in fact, that also will be part of a supplementary application for the existing carriers. But then there's the millimeter waves. And here I think there's kind of real potentials there. Here's a company in Boston called, what are they called? Starry, and there's some San Francisco company, and they're basically, this thing here, which is the size of a soda can or whatever, is supposed to give you hundreds of megabits per second right out of your window, and meaning also and to some base station. This is a prototype, so they promise it'll look prettier in the future. But basically, and that kind of is a mile or two away, so it's more than just these few hundred feet. So these millimeter waves would have kind of quite an extraordinarily fast type throughput of data relative to what exists today. Now, part of the problem of using millimeter waves or short waves generally in urban areas in particular is that they have to have a clear line of sight, which often doesn't exist. So therefore the use of millimeter waves in the past has existed. What they do, however, is to have a antenna system that is called a 4 active phased arrays, which is kind of an multiple antenna system. It's part of a more general MIMO type antenna arrangement, which can handle, and Michael explained this to me yesterday, it's like an MRI basically. It adds intelligence to and can figure out the distances, the signals. So in the end, you can use it also kind of around the corner, so to speak, and you can reach kind of quite extraordinary speeds. In fact, it's now been also pushed in the direction of mobile. There's a professor at NYU by the name of Rappaport, who's in particular been working on this kind of to reaching kind of hundreds of megabits per second of throughput. There's a German system here that will give you 100 gigabits per second line of sight type situation. There is a free space lasers that people have been kind of talking about, experimenting about. So there are all kinds of ways of moving, technological ways, of moving this away from the bottleneck. You know, the question, of course, is this, what are the regulatory issues and what are the economic business type issues? Some of the other things that I just will put on the agenda for reasons of time is that this gives an opportunity to local governments to be much more involved, because you can just kind of put a bunch of stuff on your local buildings and utility poles, etc. It would enable, in fact, encourage some shared usage. It would also kind of move in the direction of the open access type stuff, and I think that Greg and Catherine have been active in that direction. And so this is something that Google pushed about 10 years or so ago. What was it? That kind of, and that would enable other people to connect their hardware and software into the networks, into the wireless networks. There's a facilitation of resale that is necessary in the shared usage. But so let me now kind of just say, how do you do that though in the regulatory sphere? There are certain actions necessary, and that's just kind of the beginning of probably, and you can think of some more. First, you need more spectrum and more unlicensed spectrum. You may have to modify, almost certainly modify the signal strength, which for unlicensed application is fairly anemic. You have to give more access to other mobile networks and to equipment. That's that open access issue. Very important, pole attachment. The ability to put your stuff under certain pricing rules onto the network. There's more licensed 5G, more easier resale, kind of reducing the ability to have mergers that reduce the number of pipes even more. So there are 4, and that's kind of like in much of the world, it barely hanging in there. Germany's went to 3. What is it? We talked about, Dwayne, we talked about Finland yesterday was 3. Canada has 3. So all right. So you can see kind of, but the fewer there are, the kind of the less alternative pipes there would be for, not so much for the mobile part. That's kind of one of the consideration, but for the broadband part. And a bunch of other stuff, yeah, and certainly making it easier, which is a real problem, certainly in the United States now, to get anything approved in the millimeter range that kind of sits there for years, and just kind of slows down any competitive entry. So this can now then there's a so where will this all lead to? First, I think this has to be part of the next regulatory agenda, and we start by scratching our heads. Professorial type, analytical types, conceptual types, and then kind of it gets debated publicly, and then it goes into regulatory bodies that in turn kind of figure out how to implement that. But so while this is taking place, I think I would kind of not destroy net neutrality as such, because what you want to do is you want to have a point to go to. And I think that my point to go to would be when there is a competitive environment, then you can, or where there is a competitive environment, because in some areas there might already be now, then you can kind of drop these rules. But you so you move into more competition, and at the same time you relax these net neutrality restrictions. And for some of the areas which will never be competitive, you can have yardsticks. So they can basically have to follow the prices and conditions that exist in competitive areas. So there are all kinds of ways of proceeding. So all this is work in progress, and it's an attempt to think about alternative policy directions. I think this is much better than these religious wars taking place. And so I think this is very good that we have an event like this here, because it brings together people who think about it and people who have the ability to do something about it. And so that's great. So this is the end of my presentation, but I also hope it's the beginning of a discussion that may kind of bring us to some productive direction. Thank you.
Okay, there's plenty to go on here. And I love that at the end of this and our look at some of this incredible new technology, we're back to telephone poles. And I know that in a city like Calgary, access to telephone poles is cutthroat politics. Yeah. And I think that this is something that's going to be even more dynamic in the years to come. All right, there's a lot here. I'll open the floor to questions.
Steve Song, the Network Startup Resource Center. One of my fears about 5G is it kind of feels like a kind of one ring to rule them all approach by the mobile network operators. We'll use all the spectrum bands to deliver your spectrum access. And one of my observations from networks in sub-Saharan Africa is that technological homogenization kills competition. So, in Uganda, there are 8 mobile operators, and it has not done a damn thing for competition in particular. And you have cases where there are very few and good things happen. But one thing that does disrupt pricing and provokes competition is technological change. So, for instance, in South Africa, the introduction of fiber to the home completely disrupted broadband prices there. In Uganda and in Kenya, the Wi-Fi is now disrupting broadband prices. So maintaining that kind of technological diversity in terms of service providers, where there are different investment models, different upfront costs, different licensing fees, actually creates, I think, sufficient uncertainty to provoke competition in a way that the homogenization of access models then sort of tends to destroy. It provokes the kind of oligopoly. So it's a question on how do you instigate competition in a 5G world?
I'm not sure who was.
Does anyone want to jump in on that? I think your mic's up there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
My mic is still on?
Or the ones on the table.
All right. Well, people say that, as Martin did, that kind of 5G is undefined and unstandardized yet, and they kind of wring their hands and say, what's the problem? But actually, I think that's actually a good thing, because it gives different approaches. I don't think there's anything particular sacrosanct about having one particular standard. The United States for a while had CDMA and GSM type in parallel. It worked actually very well. CDMA would never have happened without that technological competition, and now everybody's using it. So I think kind of these various frequency bands and approaches, and you can have your different alternative technology hang up there on those micro tower type stuff arrangements. There's no uniformity necessary. In fact, I think it's undesirable.
I was sitting here all morning, actually starting with Adriana's presentation. So, but it kind of applies to all of them. And so one of the questions you ask is, why have a license? What are licenses for? And one of the things that was running through my mind, and it's something I haven't really heard talked about here, is this question of risk. So telecoms is a risky business, and one of the reasons to have licenses is to protect either technological risk or investment risk. And and for for entrants, they face big risks. And it occurs, I mean, and this is, again, these are random thoughts that bubble through my head, and I'd love to hear people's reaction to it, is that one of the reasons that we have vertical integration is specifically to mitigate risk, because you can manage investment and service provision kind of simultaneously. So Linda and we've had conversations about this privately. If you start divorcing those, you now have essentially an infrastructure provider that, like a farmer, would be long in wheat, and if there's big disruptions, they're extremely exposed. Their investment risk is vulnerable. Service providers are reliant on these things. I mean, I didn't mean to make another lecture here, but I'm just wondering how would you frame, if you were looking at this through the lens of risk, how would you think about your ideas, and especially with the rollout of 5G and so on?
Well, I appreciate that. And as we were discussing in relation to fixed networks, cutting off the infrastructure provider from access to the market can lead to a kind of hold-up where the investment's not made because the infrastructure provider rightly conjectures that nobody will be willing to pay for it if there's another substitute, and they'll just basically take advantage of him. However, a standard way of doing that is not to impose strict separation, but to allow the infrastructure provider to have access to the market simultaneously with a requirement to ensure that other service providers have access to the infrastructure to enable them to do it in the same way. It's not perfect, but that kind of intermediate compromise is possible, and in fact it's entirely normal.
May I also just add that the risk is also on the providers of content. I mean, it's not just on the infrastructure provider. So if they don't know if they're going to be able to reach the customers next year, they're even in higher risk.
Sorry, I have a question. I'm going to jump in right now. And it's for Martin. What you're talking about with the different verticals being provided in 5G, that runs contrary to how spectrum is allotted at the ITU right now, isn't it? I mean, will this require a revamping of how spectrum is divided at a global level, the way that we have been doing it? This is for television, this is for mobile, or can it work within the system we have right now?
Well, I envisage it would work basically, as I said, the initials MVNO come into it. So you wouldn't expect, say, Ford Motor Company to get its own spectrum, but you might expect the Ford Motor Company to make a deal of the kind which Linda has been discussing, although probably of a longer term nature, with probably a fixed commitment, to enable it to get some connectivity, which it can then use on the back of that contract in order to offer purchasers of Ford vehicles various kind of services. But the point would be that Ford Motor Company, would be the or Google, or whoever it might be, would be the organization which has the relationship with the customer and all the implications for the allocation of rents which flow from that. So I don't think it would therefore require the slicing of the network into patterns of different ownership. I mean, the phrase that I've heard used is multiple tenancies, not multiple freeholders.
I would just add something. I'd go as far to say it would be a disaster if that started to emerge. I mean, I find it really annoying that people even call spectrum 5G spectrum, and that level of labeling. So actually, decomposing it into different verticals, I think would to me be a retrograde step anyway. So it's just as a point.
Side by side with this, I entirely support the suggestion we've had from you and from Ellie, just have a whole lot more unlicensed spectrum.
Yeah, and I think there is. I mean, you see in the millimeter wave bands, there's big chunks of unlicensed there, which I think is a really good sign.
Yes. So I'm going back to my own presentation, but asking Linda and Martin, because you both mentioned, Linda, like wholesale networks may be the solution to address new technologies and spectrum, best use of spectrum, and Martin was talking about sharing, also in the same vein. However, when you take this to a context of a developing country, in general and specifically Mexico, there are governance issues, with the complexity of the model, and there's also as we talked about, or as I identified, a business model risk, of not having enough. So one of them is, what would you do if you were, because if you were in Congress, I guess, in Mexico, and had to design this, or in the ministry and had to implement it, this is really not the regulator who is doing it. Would subleasing capacity to other carriers diminish the business model risk? And then what do you do with the governance issue?
So I suppose I'd like to make a general statement first in saying what I was presenting is not the one and all solution to everything, right? So it was just, I think it's an important way forward to move things on. And I do, going back to Steve's comment earlier, I do think a heterogeneity of solutions to things is still part of our future in many ways. I think the challenge I still find with this wholesale stuff is that when you describe it, you're describing a steady state market perspective. And how you bootstrap the market to get there is a challenge. And there are all sorts of options in doing that. And in bootstrapping the market, you might, for example, decide to put less of your resources out and hold back some for some more longer term things that Martin just spoke about. And I think there is a fine line in kind of understanding where the balance is there that isn't then kind of repeating the sins of the past and making sure that there's the flexibility for it to fully go that way in the future. So I think, I suppose in summary, yes, the market needs to be bootstrapped in some way, because also I think if you look at some of the newer types of, and you mentioned it I think in your own presentation, and Adriana has as well, some of the newer kinds of, if we want to just call them virtual network operators of the future, they need time to emerge as well. So you're working with the current situation. You're waiting for the new businesses to emerge. You want to make sure they have the opportunity to emerge, but at the same time not kill off the possibility by wrecking the wholesale potential in the meantime. So I think it's a difficult question, and I don't know the full answer, and there is some kind of balance between those two.
On the face of it, the existence of a wholesale-only network should facilitate the access which the verticals would get to capacity in order to compete with vertically integrated mobile networks. So I think it would actually be a step forward.
And can I just add, when you were talking about network slicing, so because I was giving a short presentation, I just described it as capacity, and there's really interesting work out there now that says, okay, it's not just about capacity anymore, it's about latency, it's about reliability and resilience and all those things in a network. So network slicing potentially has the opportunity to give you a slice that has those characteristics, as you pointed out, Martin. So you can also think of the wholesale market as a bunch of products that are not just about capacity but have those features as well. Now that complicates it further, but there is a potential for this to actually, this framework to move as those kind of things emerge as technically possible.
Okay, my name is Dwayne Winsek, School of Journalism and Communication, Carleton University. My question is first for Martin. Ellie, you may want to lean in on it as well if it kind of fits up your alley. I think it does. But recently in Europe, BEREC, here in Canada, CRTC, the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India, and of course last year, or 2015, the FCC all adopted some restrictions on zero-rated services, and the FCC underpinned it with a very robust net neutrality, the reclassification rules that Ellie points out to. There's been a bunch of blowback from think tanks, and we don't need to go into which ones, but one of the bodies that they're trotting out, one of the victims that they're trotting out is 5G, Internet of Things stuff. So they're saying basically that the BEREC, net neutrality guidelines, the CRTC's differential pricing framework, so on and so forth, are going to kill the baby before it's born. What do you think?
Well, it's very hard for me to see how the world which I described would make sense of net neutrality rules, because net neutrality rules is the notion that there's a kind of fallback best efforts arrangement which anything can be put on, whereas what I was thinking of and what flows, as Indra said, from network pricing, network slicing, is that just wouldn't exist. There'd be a whole range of different products which were geared to meet the needs of different types of downstream services. And so to say that everybody had to use the same one would effectively rule out the implementation of that particular program. So I don't honestly see how network neutrality rules, which typically, as in Europe, make very modest provisions for special services or specialist services, how, if this became widespread, they would be sustainable. On the other hand, if the economy is going to be digitized and society is going to be digitized in the way which I'm suggesting, it does seem quite a heavy price to pay to maintain net neutrality, to prevent those technological developments from taking place. We have to think of other ways of doing the same thing.
Response. I think with the managed services carve-outs that these rules tend to have, and then within the rules themselves, there's also provisions for allowing for quality of service distinctions. So the idea that there's this idea that videos and CAT scans are going to be treated similarly under net neutrality rules, I think is it's bogus. Basically, you can network operator, I think, can distinguish between different types of traffic based upon the requirements that they need, but within particular types of traffic. So, for example, the heart monitoring or the CAT scan versus the CAT video, they can distinguish between them. But when it comes down to CAT videos, there's no way that your CAT video is getting priority over my CAT video. My CAT scan is going down the pipes just as fast as yours. Isn't that the way this stuff really works? Or am I misguided? So these are like hot button issues, at least for me. And I want to get it straight and get it straight from authoritative sources.
I'm not sure I qualify in the latter category, but my understanding of the BEREC rules is that they impose very tough conditions upon the circumstances in which you can deviate from the standard conditions of carriage. If you look at what those rules are as set out in the guidelines which they published in autumn last year, I think the general view is that they are in fact really quite restrictive, and they adequately reflect the way in which the technology is providing mobile broadband at the moment, but they may not in the future. So, and then of course, once you allow wide variations, you then end up with a whole slew of classification problems. What is a cat video? Is it different when it's a black cat or a white cat, and or other equivalent things? So you have to have an adjudicator for that, and I suspect that actually implementing rules to do that would require a whole bunch of people sitting in a regulatory office and looking at different types of things and saying, well, are these the same or are they not? Which would be difficult.
Ellie, a question for you. Back in 1998, you gave a opening speech in the ITS conference. You remember, in Stockholm?
I cannot remember it in detail.
At that time, you were talking about the future of wireless, basically, how wireless technologies would be used, and trying to give a sense of, the main idea was like the spectrum would be used in ways that weren't being discussed at that time, and basically used everywhere at any time without having to go through licensing and stuff like that. With 5G now and all these new technologies, can you give us a sense of, if you remember those times, or that time when you were just giving that presentation and the situation now? Give us like a contrast or something like that.
He wants you to recant, I think.
No. Well, you see, it seems that it's very difficult to change the status quo in anything. So you have, in existing spectrum bands, you have kind of their established interests and arrangements, and it's very difficult. The FCC now took them about 10 years to move some spectrum from broadcasters to others, and I think it just ended. It's not even done. It's cost $19 billion, but I mean, it brought in $19 billion, but of those $12 billion is just the cost of paying off the established broadcasters to go away in a limited way, to go to abandon, to relinquish their spectrum rights. So the most promising territory is therefore areas in which there's not much action going on. These millimeter wave territory, in fact, would lend itself beautifully to large unlicensed approaches that would enable multiple providers. It would enable new kind of industrial structures, new technologies. And so that would actually be the area to focus on. That would also require a regulatory system that is a little bit faster on the draw when it comes to approval of things. I mean, government will be involved in this in some fashion. You cannot just go in some millimeter wave and then kind of blast a hugely powerful signal. So there are regulatory issues here too. But that would be a kind of a beautiful area for people to enter without licenses and do all kinds of interesting things.
I think this is going to be our last question.
Hi, Ben Klass from Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication. Last night we heard Mark Raboy relate a story about an inventor of a magnificent wireless technology who proceeded to monopolize that technology to the point at which governments convened and decided that this was not in the best interest of any of their societies or all of them, and prevented that entrepreneur from monopolizing this wireless technology. Sounds a lot like what we've been talking about today, but what I'm talking about and what Mark was telling us last night was in fact about Marconi and the invention of the ability to transmit information over wireless technology in the first place. The decision at the time to prevent Marconi from monopolizing that technology, I think, strikes me as prudent, but took coordination at a level that I haven't heard about today or yesterday, really. So I was wondering if, this is a question for the panel, is there a role for some sort of international coordination? I mean, we can all agree that monopoly is bad and that making technology available to as wide a proportion of the world's population as possible is good, but we're still here talking about monopoly, people being prevented from having access to these things despite their wide availability to others. Is there a role for the international community to set some sort of a best practice standard, and what might that look like?
I'll just make a couple of comments. So it's funny that you asked that, because when I mentioned earlier, I was at this MVNO World thing, and this doesn't directly answer your question, but we did come away thinking we need a union for MVNOs to be able to voice where they sit, because ultimately what I found in that was that at none of the public talks that I went to did anyone express any negativity about the underlying MNO, because they are too afraid of the relationship that they need to foster. So I definitely think something is needed. I could be expressing this incorrectly, but Martin, you correct me if I'm wrong in this. But I was talking to Martin last night about the Myth of 5G, the book that William Webb wrote, and Martin. I think one of the arguments William makes, and I hope I'm correct in saying this, is to a certain extent we're all in collusion, certainly in Europe in terms of 5G, for example, and academics, and we're all kind of going along with stuff as well. So for example, there's kind of certain vision of 5G, whether you agree with it or not, and you know, that feeds a whole big industry, and it feeds a whole big research industry as well. So I suppose there's also some space for self-reflection on how we engage with that. And I think the final comment I'll make is for some reason, our Industrial Development Authority has always wanted to attract AT&T to Ireland, and it's kind of the missing. We've 9 out of 10 of the top of these telecoms companies in the world, and this is the 10th apparently by whatever. But I really realised the power of AT&T when so there was an announcement made at Mobile World Congress that AT&T was doing some collaboration in Dublin, and my God, there was a queue of people to talk to people from Dublin because of it. And it is really amazing the power of these entities, and the power that they wield. And I think it's very, very hard to understand how we would organise around it. But I'm glad you asked the question. But there are just some rambling thoughts on that. 3 different thoughts.
It's a bit like the Tolstoyan question. If bad people can get together to screw things up, why cannot good people get together to make things better? And unfortunately, that question applies not only to national regulation or regional regulation like the European Union, but I guess it clearly applies to world regulation as well.
I would kind of say something similar. If you kind of go back, the ITU is the oldest regulatory agency in the world, so it's got about 150 or so almost years of record, and there's really kind of the notion of some kind of global coordination sounds noble and worthy, but the reality is quite different. So it leads to politicization, to along national lines, but also along kind of corporate lines in which countries represent their industries and slow the process down to give their industry, their standards, some options. And so I think that on the whole, in an industry that in a technology area that operates along progress along Moore's law type rate, to go to an agency system that operates on 19th century international treaty negotiations is simply asking for trouble. So I think it's the lesser evil is to let things roll without coordination.
Okay, I know that we could keep going, and I hope that we will, but we do have, we're running out of time, and we do have lunch to get to. We do have further discussions to have among ourselves, and but I would really like to thank this last panel for taking a look at really what's coming up. And you can just, from what we've heard, whatever's going to happen, we're looking at some fundamental shifts. And I'm really glad that the regulators, again, are in this room. Have fun with this, regulators. You've got a lot of work coming up, I think. And so anyway, some applause for our last panel, please.